And it's a very interesting book, one of my favorites in the Old Testament. He, in the Hebrew Bible, was placed in the, if you remember, there are three sections, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. Ketuvim are the writings. Daniel was placed in the writings. Even though he had many prophetic visions and future events in the book, the Hebrew Bible placed him there. We talked a little bit about this last week when we looked at Lamentations. So why would Daniel, who had many prophecies, probably more than almost any other book as far as percentage of the book, be put in the writing section rather than with the prophets? You guys remember we talked about last week? Yes. His role was not as a classic Old Testament prophet. So certainly prophets had foretelling in their sermons, but remember, Old Testament prophets were primarily preachers who were calling the people to faithfulness to the covenant. So usually the people of Israel would be straying, they would be raised up by God, he would call them to repentance. The prophet would then also talk about future events. Sometimes this is what's going to happen if you don't turn, and then other times the prophets would describe future events that God's promised to restore Israel at some point. But Daniel, he was a royal official in the Babylonian government. So his role was not exactly the same as the Old Testament prophets. And so that's why you see Daniel, I believe, that's why you see Daniel and Lamentations in the writings section. Though later, the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which was done around 200 years before Christ, they put Daniel with the prophets. And that's what we have today in our modern text in the canon. We have Daniel with the prophets because the Greek concept of prophecy was more the idea of future events as opposed to the classic Old Testament prophet role. And so that's my theory. Take it or leave it, but I think it makes sense given what we see in the Hebrew Bible. It doesn't matter in the sense that they're still inspired. All the books in the Hebrew Bible are in our New Testament and our Old Testaments that we have today. It's just the order is a little different. And it's sometimes helpful to understand this because as you look at Daniel, Jesus did call him a prophet, but it was in the sense more of the future events that he foretold, the more the Greek sense of that word, prophetes. But Daniel is in the writings, and he had many interesting things to say and many interesting events that were given to him, and a lot of detail, more detail really than many of the other prophets, the events that Daniel describes. Now, of course, I want to, on the front of your handout, you've got the sort of the overview of the book, and we'll touch on that as we go through. And then on the back, I put a few pages there if you want to take notes, but basically it'll guide our discussion. Because the first question I want to ask and answer is, who's the author? Now, of course, the title of the book gives it away, but this is actually, among all the Old Testament books, Daniel is probably the most attacked as far as authorship and authenticity. Do you know why that is? Most of the liberal scholars, historical critics, Daniel's the book that gets the most heat. Why do you think that might be? Yes, his prophecies are so exact that, like, for example, Daniel chapter 11, which describes after Alexander the Great dies, and the four kings that rise up, and it describes in such good detail that the scholars look at that and go, there's no way he could have been that accurate. This had to have been written after it happened. That's the mentality, because they do not believe in supernatural events. And so you'll see this quite often, by the way. Authorship will be attacked. And why does that matter? Well, because if the book says who the author is, which Daniel does, and we'll see that in a minute, it's inspired text, right? Holy Spirit made sure that Daniel put those words on the page, right? So if we say, well, no, even though it says Daniel, this is actually somebody else who is trying to portray himself as Daniel. Might there be a problem with that? What would be the problem with that kind of mindset or thinking? You can say it out loud. If it's not Daniel, then, but it says it's Daniel, we have a problem with the integrity of the word, don't we? And this is true for, you'll see this on almost every book. Scholars from the 18th century on just started to attack authorship because that's the easiest way in their minds, and this is my opinion again, to undermine the integrity and inerrancy of the Word. If I can, if this is not the author who says he's the author, then we can't really trust everything in the book. And so I do want to spend a moment on authorship, just again, so that we can see from the text, it tells us who the author is. And so as we look at this book of Daniel, there's evidence within the book that make it clear, and there's evidence outside of the book that makes it clear that it's from Daniel. Daniel, of course, begins in chapter 1 with his history. I thought it'd be helpful to read this. Could I get somebody to read Daniel 1 through 7? This is how the book opens and gives us the background of this man. Anybody be willing to read that? No, I'll make Norm read it, so. Okay, you're up, buddy. Can you read Daniel 1 through 7? All right, great, thank you. Now, I know this story is pretty familiar to most of us, probably. We understand this during the Babylonian, the first attack by Nebuchadnezzar, King Nebuchadnezzar. He came in, and they took out many of the youths. This was common practice in the ancient Near East. If you were to go in and conquer a nation, you would extract the best and the brightest to serve in your courts. And that's exactly what happens here. We see 4 individuals mentioned specifically here. Now, there were many more taken, but these 4 are the ones specifically mentioned. And notice Daniel's name appears on the list. And what's interesting is there are many extra biblical writings from that time period. There's some writings from the Persians that they found where they mentioned this practice. Of course, Persia was the next kingdom after Babylon. They mentioned this practice of taking youths, and normally they would take young men at 14 years old and train them until they were 17. And that's interesting because that matches exactly, or at least the time period of 3 years matches what's mentioned here, that the king took these young men and trained them for 3 years. So it's very likely Daniel was in his teenage years when he was taken. We don't know exactly, but we do see Daniel is still alive at the end of the 70-year exile. So he couldn't have been that much older than 20, probably younger than 20, because that would put him in his 90s at the end of the book. Again, he doesn't say his exact age here, but I think that's a reasonable assumption, expectation, given what we know from extra-biblical writings and the fact that, the time period of the book. Now, as we look at this, Daniel's name is mentioned in the book over 70 times. And it's mentioned in the third person, as we see here, and in chapters 1 through 7. But then when you get to chapter 8, we begin to see Daniel's name in the first person. In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one which appeared to me previously. Now it happened when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. Go to Daniel 9, same thing. In the 1st year of his reign, I, Daniel, discerned the books a number of years concerning. Chapter 10, in those days I, Daniel, had been mourning. Chapter 12, I, Daniel. So in the last 5 chapters, Daniel speaks in the first person, indicating clearly he's the one who wrote this. Now in the first 7 chapters, he's in the third person because it's a narratival form given there. And we see this often in many of the books of the Bible, right? Who wrote the book of Genesis, for example, in Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus? Moses did, right? Yet Moses refers to himself in the third person all the way through the book. Of course, Jesus and others indicate these are the books of Moses, so we know he is the author. But this was a common approach in the Old Testament scriptures, particularly in narrative types of passages, where the author would refer to himself in the third person at times. And that's clearly what's happening here in Daniel, because in the last 5 chapters, he's in the first person. So we're given here in the text, in the inspired writing of Scripture, Daniel gives himself as the author multiple times. All right? So again, this is why when those who come along and say, well, it was somebody posing as Daniel who wanted to, in the 3rd century, wanted to encourage the exiled, the people in the time when the Seleucid kings were ruling and they were under their oppression. And so this man wrote a book from Daniel, claiming to be Daniel, so that he could encourage those people in that time. That's the common argument. And then they'll throw stuff in like, well, and notice there's many terms here which weren't used back in the 7th century. They were later on. This is a very, very common argument used. So again, I just want to mention it because that's what you'll be exposed to, even by sometimes people you wouldn't expect, even conservative authors now, conservative scholars. I'm seeing hints of their giving in to some of these ideas. In Daniel 4, for example, where it's Nebuchadnezzar is the one speaking, Daniel records a particular event in Nebuchadnezzar's life. And even though it says several times, I, Nebuchadnezzar, they'll say, no, that wasn't really Nebuchadnezzar. This was another guy named Nabonidus. And there's reasons for that. But the problem I have is I was reading from a conservative preaching series, and the author actually held to that view. And this was a guy in our circles. I'm like, what? You got to be kidding me. It's because he was influenced by these liberal scholars. So we need to be careful. Now, I think there's the one clear evidence within the book that Daniel's the author. There's also a very strong argument to be made for an external reference to Daniel elsewhere. Daniel is quoted by someone else in the New Testament. Does anyone remember? In a prophetic text. When Daniel talks about the abomination of desolation, someone in the New Testament quotes from that verse. Jesus did. Remember Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus reveals future events, when the temple will be destroyed, when he would return. And he says there, I'll mention Ezekiel in a minute. This is, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through, it doesn't say the book of Daniel. Jesus said Daniel the prophet. So Christ himself affirms authorship. To me, that's sort of the end of the argument, isn't it? I mean, okay. If we can't believe what Jesus said, then we have a bigger problem even. So this is an affirmation of the authorship of Daniel. Now, very interesting, Ezekiel, and I'm going to need someone to read this for me. Ezekiel mentions Daniel in one of his one of his sermons. Could somebody read? This is from Ezekiel chapter 14, verses 12 to 14 and 20. Could someone read that for me? Thanks. Here in Ezekiel 14, Ezekiel is again preaching to the people in his day, which, by the way, Ezekiel was a prophet during the exile, during the Babylonian exile. So he and Daniel would have been alive at the same time. Daniel was probably around 30 years old at the time that Ezekiel wrote this, in his 30s, probably early 30s. And notice how Ezekiel says, okay, Lord, you guys have blown it, and consequences are coming, and even if these three guys were in your midst, I would still carry out my correction on you. Kind of reminds us back of Moses. Remember when he was bargaining with God regarding Sodom? Abraham, sorry. Moses wrote about it. Abraham did it. Abraham, when he was negotiating with the Lord, if there's 20 righteous, 10 righteous, this kind of reminds me of that a little bit. But here, it's interesting, the three guys that Ezekiel picks. What do they have in common, do you think? Okay, they all suffered. They were all faithful. And in fact, they were the most faithful. If you think about Noah, who was preserved through the flood? Noah and his family, who they were riding his coattails, I think, because it says, what does Genesis say about Noah? Genesis 6. He was righteous, right? God favored him. He was the only, probably, righteous man on the earth at that time. And then Job, do you remember what God said about Job? Very beginning. What he said to Satan? Have you seen my servant Job? There is no one like him on all the earth, blameless and upright. So what do you think that tells us about Daniel? I think that he's in that category with these two other men because he was the most righteous man on the earth at that time. And we see evidence of that in how he's addressed by angels. Later in Daniel 9 and Daniel 10, he's called by Gabriel a man of high esteem. And in chapter 10, he is described from heaven. They see him as one highly esteemed. And that's quite a compliment from an angelic being. So I think he's in this list not only because he's a contemporary, but because also he was known as a godly man. And we see evidence of this all through the book of Daniel, don't we? Those of you that remember the story, what are some examples of Daniel's godliness and integrity that you can remember from the book? Anybody? Yeah, that's right. At the beginning, right? In Daniel 1, he was offered to find food from the king, but he didn't eat it. Not because he didn't like what they were serving, but because he thought it would bring dishonor to the Lord. There was likely some unkosher food that was being offered. And so Daniel, as a 14 or 15-year-old, took a stand. That's quite amazing. Anything else from the book that you remember from the book of Daniel that shows us his character? Yeah, Daniel 6, that's right. He was consistent in his prayer life, and even in the midst of when that edict was passed by the king, King Darius, not to pray to any other god but the king, Daniel still did it, knowing it would cost him. And you remember even in that same story, the other leaders, they wanted to catch Daniel, right? They didn't like him. Favor was upon him. He was exceeding them in his abilities and in his effect in the kingdom. And by the time of Daniel 6, he's like in his 80s now. And so it says there in Daniel 6, they looked into his past, they looked into his character, they looked into his history. They couldn't find anything against him. This is an 80-plus-year-old man. They had a lot to work with. And they still couldn't find. It's repeated twice there, I think, for emphasis. Quite amazing. And again, we know this is the grace of God at work in his life. But Daniel's one of the few, if not only, men in the Bible that there's nothing mentioned about any particular sin that he committed. I'm not saying he's sinless. I'm just saying the Bible didn't record. Daniel later in Daniel 9 says, I'm a sinner, and he confessed his sin. So I'm not saying that at all, but it's kind of interesting that the Bible didn't record any events in his life that, as we've seen in many other Bible characters. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting. He's a man I have a high degree of respect for, just in how he was able to have integrity over the course of his life in a pagan land like that, and yet just shows the grace of God that can work in someone willing to follow him. So we have this young man, Daniel, who we see taken into Babylon in his teenage years, lives out his life as an official in a Babylonian court. In fact, it says in chapter 1, I believe, or 2, that after he was raised up to head over all of the wise men in the kingdom. That God granted him favor, and the king looked upon him with favor. There's an interesting, if you look at, he's mentioned again in Ezekiel 28, by the way. So the wisdom of Daniel was also well known at that time. This he said sarcastically to the people. So Daniel 4, interesting chapter. Vincent, can I have you read what I've got up here? This is Daniel 4, 1-4, and then verse 37. It's Old Testament, yeah, kind of toward the back. Yeah, Norm had trouble finding it too. We'll work on. Maybe we'll memorize the order of the books. Yeah, and then skip down to verse 37. And then in my palace, in verse 37. Of course, we know from this story, if you remember, Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, and it was a warning to him. It was a dream of a great tree, and then it got chopped down, and Daniel said, this is a warning to you, king. God's given you this kingdom. Basically don't take that credit for yourself. Well, he ends up doing that, right? He goes out on his palace one day, and he looks out upon Babylon. Oh, isn't this not a great land, which I myself have built? And then, of course, he's made to eat grass for 7 periods of time. Which, by the way, is another thing that they use to attack the book. They say, well, we have all these records from the Babylonian Chronicles and from all of these different documents in history, and there's no record really of this happening in Nebuchadnezzar's life. And there's no gap that we can see here that would explain this kind of action. So they use the argument from silence. Absence of evidence, by the way, is not evidence of absence. You know that, right? Just because it can't be found in extra biblical documents doesn't mean that it's not there, just that it hasn't been found. But we don't rely on extra biblical documents as the ultimate say, do we? No. And by the way, the reason I fired up about this, I did my OTI paper, Vincent, was on this topic for this book, and it just really interested me. But they'll say, there's no gap. Well, actually, if you do a careful examination of the records, there is an 8-year gap in the Babylonian records that has nothing. And, by the way, no king would ever document something like this in their records, right? In fact, you remember when Sennacherib, when his army was wiped out by the angel of the Lord in Isaiah 38, I think it is, 185,000, and he went back, was defeated. They actually found records of his time in Israel, and that's never mentioned. Only that he had these great victories. And he did have some, But when he got to Jerusalem, his whole army was wiped out. Well, that wasn't mentioned in his account. So that's one thing. And the other thing as well is, there actually is a gap in the record of about 8 or 9 years. And so there's actually a statement Nebuchadnezzar made in one of the records about it's called the Nebuchadnezzar inscription. And it talks about him not feeling well or something like that for a period of time. It's kind of interesting. So, it's just to me, anyway, I'll preach a sermon on this if I'm not careful. But here, this chapter is interesting, not just because of those things, but also notice here who's speaking. Who's describing the events? Nebuchadnezzar himself. So here's an example where I think Daniel either, had recorded for him, Nebuchadnezzar spoke to him or wrote it down, we don't know, and Daniel included this in the book of Daniel. Now, a question we always want to ask as Bible students is, why did Daniel do that? Why did he put this story in and have Nebuchadnezzar give it in the first person? And why did he put it where he put it in the book? Something to think about. Well, maybe we'll come back to that if we have time. Yes. Yep. Because we see again in Daniel 5, same thing happens, or a similar event happens, right? With Belshazzar, who's a descendant of or related to Nebuchadnezzar. He's the last king of the Babylonian Empire, and he too was humbled. So even though Israel was suffering the consequences of their sin in the 70-year exile, God continued to show, hey, I'm still in charge. And in fact, in Daniel 4, that was the point. Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel said, recognize God put you here. He gave you this kingdom. Okay, so we're come back to this at the end when we look at the major theme in the book. But this book would be of great encouragement to the people in Daniel's day, as well as all through Israel's history, because it shows, look, this king who was the most powerful guy on the planet at this time had amazing victories over Egypt, over Assyria, many others, and how he himself was humbled in the way that he was, and what he says at the end, which we'll come back to, what he declares. But always be thinking that way as you're reading through any book of the Bible, sort of as you're going through, why is this here? Why did the author put it here? And how does it connect to what's around it and to connect to the book itself? There's nothing random from these biblical writers. Now, knowing that Daniel was the author, knowing these historical figures that are mentioned in the book, even in the first person, when do you think this book was written? We actually have some direct statements in the book itself of the time period which it covers, but also at least around the time that it would have been written. In the first verse, which Norm read, in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, this would have been the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, which is mentioned elsewhere. So we would place this around 605 BC if you take extra biblical documents, figuring out the timeline. 605 is an important year to remember. It is the first siege by the Babylonians into Israel, into Judah in particular. So that's the first event recorded when Daniel and his friends are taken into Babylon. And then, so this was Darius, so if you remember what happened, chapter 5 of Daniel, Belshazzar, the hand on the wall, the handwriting on the wall, it was regarding, this handwriting basically was saying, you're done. Mene, Tekel Perez, I think was how Daniel interpreted what was written, and those all referred to the fact that he said the Persians are going to conquer you. And that's happened that very night. That's what took place. Now that happened in almost 70 years after the first siege of Israel, 605. And Cyrus was the king. Cyrus was, in Isaiah, what was it, 48? 45. Cyrus was predicted 100 years before by God, through the prophet Isaiah, that Cyrus would be God's servant. And actually, Cyrus was the one who was king of Persia when they came in and destroyed Babylon, wiped out Babylon, took over. And he appointed a man named Darius to be the local regent over the region of Babylon. Persia had a much larger scope. In fact, I think it was the largest empire up to that point. And Darius was the one appointed there. Now, I mention this because there's another Darius that we read about in Ezra. And he was actually a king of Persia that followed Cyrus a few kings later. So don't get confused. This guy is a Mede. There was Persia and Media. Persia overcame Media as well, but there was an alliance there, and so Cyrus appoints Darius to be the king or local regent of the Babylonian region. We see this with Herod, right, in the New Testament. He's called King Herod, isn't he? But he wasn't king of the Roman Empire. He was placed there by the Roman emperor to be ruler in that region. So Darius had the same role. So I just bring this up so you don't get confused when you see that name twice. And again, scholars attack this guy. Oh, we don't see any record of Darius. Therefore, he didn't exist. Therefore, this is not true. But again, I believe the Bible over those guys. In fact, I put a footnote here, some verses that you can look up regarding Cyrus's conquering. That was another freebie. That was just a side note. So I know he paid a lot for this equipping hour, so I want to give you a lot of good stuff in addition to the notes. But the structure of, any questions so far? I'm operating at high speed, dumping a lot of stuff out there. Hopefully some of it's helpful. Okay. Here was the last, Daniel 10, verse 1, the third year of Cyrus. So this is the last time period mentioned in the book. This was, again, 3 years after the Babylonians, the Persians defeated Babylon, and Daniel's given a vision in chapter 10 in the third year of Cyrus. So it's likely he wrote this probably not long after. Because again, by this time, Daniel's in his mid to late 80s, if not 90 years old. He probably didn't make it too much further after that. So just based on that, knowing he's the author, probably around this time period is when he wrote the book. Okay, structure. Interesting structure. Remember last week when we looked at Lamentations, the unique features there? Daniel, too, has some unique features in how he's structured and laid out his book. He has a couple of different arrangements. One is by genre. Chapters 1 to 6 are primarily narrative in form. They're written as a story, like Nebuchadnezzar when he was humbled. Daniel chapter 3, the three men Daniel's three friends who were then thrown into the fire. Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the statue and that he was going to kill all the wise men if no one could interpret it. Daniel chapter 5, the description of the handwriting on the wall. Daniel 4, Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel 6, Daniel lines them. These are all written in narrative form. But then when we get to Daniel chapter 7, in fact, here's a summary of those first 6 chapters. And I also noted as well they almost seem to follow a chronological order. The first chapter describes when Daniel's taken in and what happens in that first year. And then it gives sort of an overview at the end of the chapter that Daniel stayed as a wise man and was leader of the wise men over the course of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. In fact, it says all the way until the first year of Cyrus. And then we get the second chapter, some events that take place in Daniel's first or second year is that when the king had a dream. What was the dream of? Who remembers? The big statue, right? Gold head, silver chest and arms, bronze thighs, iron and clay legs, right? And this was a dream given to Nebuchadnezzar, and he said, you need to tell me what I dreamed and then tell me what it means. And none of his wise men could do it, of course, right? No king has ever asked something like this before. Basically, that was their respectful way of saying, are you crazy? And so Nebuchadnezzar said, fine, you can't help me. What good are you guys? I'm going to kill you all. And then, of course, Daniel it says immediately, it's another example, great example to us. He immediately gathers his friends and they pray. Say, God, please give us insight. And so then this young man, this 15, 16-year-old young man, tells the king, I can interpret the dream for you. And actually not me, it's my God who can do that. So of course he does. The dream is a dream of, interestingly enough, the four major empires. Babylon, Persia. Who comes after Persia? Greece, Alexander the Great, remember him? And then Rome. And so the king's given this dream. Again, you have to think, why does Daniel write about this? Well, he's opening up the theme of this book. So in the second year, probably, of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, we have this dream that the king has, and Daniel interprets it. And then we have this story of the three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, which is their given names. They were, of course, you remember that, they wouldn't bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's giant statue. And I believe this chapter did occur after chapter 2, because chapter 2 was early in Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Chapter 4 is when Nebuchadnezzar was humbled significantly and declares this amazing testimony about the God of heaven. So I think this event took place somewhere between those two. And if you remember, Daniel's three friends wouldn't bow down. Now, some of you may have, you read that chapter, you see a lot of repetition, don't you? Actually, you see it in chapter 2. You see it in chapter 4. There's repetition, saying the same thing over 2 or 3 times. You remember in chapter 3, so I forget how it's worded, but the musicians brought their instruments, and then these horns played, and then these played, and then these played, and it repeats it a couple of times. Well, that was common for the language it was written in, which takes us to the other structural feature of the book, is that Daniel wrote in 2 languages in this book. Hold on to that thought. I'll come right back to it. Then chapter 4, as I mentioned, probably later in Nebuchadnezzar's reign. The Septuagint actually dates it. Whether or not it's accurate, we can't know for sure, but they date it toward 588 BC, which would have been about in the middle of his reign, but likely happened toward the end of his reign later on. And then chapter 5, this is dated right at the eve of the Babylonian destruction at the hands of Persia. And then we have Daniel 6, which was in the first year of the Persian reign. So you can see a general chronological order of these particular events in the book. It's narrative in structure. But then we get to chapter 7 when the genre changes. The focus is, it's all prophetic or future events in these last 5 chapters, 6 chapters. Where we go from this narrative format to more of it's still narrative features, but the emphasis is on future events. Remember Daniel 3, it was present-day events with the 3 men in the fire. Daniel 4 was Nebuchadnezzar, present-day events of him being humbled. Daniel chapter 5, present-day events. Now, there was a prophecy there of the hand, what it wrote, but that prophecy actually happened that night. Daniel 6 was present-day events. But then you get to Daniel 7, and he has a vision of the future. Daniel 8, another vision. Daniel 9, he's given insight into the events that were going to happen over the course of human history. Daniel 10, vision. Daniel 11, he's given prophetic events in the period between Greece or Persia and Rome. And then Daniel 12 is the end. He's given insight into what was going to happen at the end of human history. So, there's definitely a shift in style, a shift in focus as far as the style of writing is concerned. There's also another structural feature that is, I mentioned a moment ago, and that is that Daniel writes in 2 different languages. The first part of the book, Daniel 1 up to the middle of verse 4 in chapter 2, is written in Hebrew. Hebrew grammar, Hebrew language. So the historical setting, the introduction of the king's dream, just before it's described, is all in Hebrew. But then when we get to the description of the king's dream, here, let's just look at it real quick. So the king said to them, I had a dream. My spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. So that's in Hebrew. But then right after this, O king, live forever. Say the dream to your servant. This is in Aramaic. And it's Aramaic all the way through to the end of chapter 7. And then in chapter 8, verse 1, he switches back to Hebrew. Kind of strange. Why would he do that? Now, we don't notice this in our English text, except the LSB translation tells us, gives us a footnote. The text is in Aramaic from here to 728. I think most translations do. Let me see if the ESV gave us a hint. Yes, they also had a footnote. Okay, so for some reason, Daniel shifts. And Aramaic and Hebrew are different grammatically. There's a lot of similarity. There's a lot of shared words in terms of vocabulary, but they are different languages. And in fact, so different, if you will remember, in in Nehemiah 8 or 9, when Ezra reads the Word of God to the people, and he reads it in Hebrew, and they needed translators to explain it to the people, because not everybody knew Hebrew very well by that point after the exile. So, Aramaic, by the way, who knows what is Aramaic? What's the significance of that language at that time? Anybody? Old Testament language scholars here? It was the lingua franca of that. It was the language of the empire. Kind of like what happened with Greek and then Latin. You know, as each empire came in, and we've seen it in modern examples today, where even in the colonization of countries over the last several centuries, where they adopt the language of the colonizer. And now there is a lingua franca today or all around the world. What language is that? English, which I praise God for, because it allows me to go to a lot of places and be able to speak in English and serve in that way, because I couldn't learn how many thousands of languages are there on our planet? But yeah, so lingua franca just means that's the language of the land. And so Aramaic was the language of the land, all the way even to Jesus and the disciples spoke Aramaic. It was adopted into the Jewish culture. So, but here, at this point in time, Aramaic was, right, they had just come into the Babylon, to the exile. And so Daniel writes from this point all the way through chapter 7 in Gentile language, and then reverts back in chapter 8 to Hebrew. Why would that be? What do you think is going on here? Any thoughts about that? This is unique in that only 2 books do this. Okay, what's the other book first? You remember? Ezra. Ezra does the same thing. Yeah. Yeah, so the audience is being considered here, that Daniel intended not only for this book to be understood by people of Judah, but also the Gentiles. And there's an emphasis in those 6 chapters, 6 chapters, chapters 2 to 7. The focus there is on the Gentiles and the Gentile nations. Think about it, right? Chapter 2, it's a description of the 4 kingdoms, the 4 Gentile kingdoms that were going to be raised up and then ultimately crushed by God's kingdom. Chapter 3 was this Gentile ruler who wanted to be worshipped, and then when he wasn't, these 3 Jewish young men were thrown into the fire, and God preserved them. Chapter 4 was all about this Gentile king and how God humbled him. Chapter 5 focused on again, the Gentiles, the ruler Belshazzar at the time, king of Babylon, and how a Gentile nation defeated them. Chapter 6, Daniel is again in a Gentile land, and this Gentile king Darius. Then you get to chapter 7, and it talks again about these four beasts. Actually, I didn't go through those, did I? Be helpful to just briefly. Chapter 7 is the vision of the four beasts and the Son of Man. So again, it covers really the events, or what's described in chapter 2. It's describing these four empires that are going to come through, but it adds to it this, remember the Ancient of Days, one like a Son of Man came before the Ancient of Days, and to him was given a kingdom and a dominion. That's in chapter 7. So again, there's the Gentile kingdoms that are our focus. But then when you get to chapter 8, it goes specifically back to Israel and what God has in store for Israel. In those last 5 chapters, that's the focus. Gentiles are involved in those chapters, but there's a shift in the emphasis. There's a shift in the focus. So I think it makes sense here. I believe, there's a couple of audiences Daniel has in mind here. Obviously, his people, as an encouragement to them, so they could remember God's not forgotten us. And in fact, notice, here's some examples. God has described events that are going to take place, and the Gentiles will have a power over us for a period of time, but not forever. And even in the midst of being under the thumb of the Gentile empires, God's still showing his sovereign hand in that he humbles these Gentile kings. He preserves these 3 men. He preserves Daniel. He shows that he's still in control. So I think just there's a shift in style in 2 ways here. And that's what's interesting in this book. There's a shift in the genre, chapters 1 to 6 narrative, 7 to 12 more future events. Then there's a shift in language, but it overlaps. Chapter 7 is the overlapping chapter, where it's written in Aramaic, but it's also part of the future visions section. You following me? Just nod. It'll make me feel good even if you're not. So it's just, again, a very interesting way Daniel structured this book, but it helps us keep in mind not only the purpose of his book, but even to whom he intends his message to be given. And Ezra is also one other place where we see this 2 languages used. Ezra 4 through 6, or 4:8 to 6 something, is in Aramaic as well. But it's because it's transcribing Aramaic documents into the book. Okay. Now let me jump back ahead. As we look at the structure of the book, in your notes there on the first page, you have sort of this overview that's given there. And there's the sort of the description of each of the chapters, some of the details. Notice here it mentions the shift in language between Hebrew and Aramaic. And there's kind of an interesting feature here. Thomas loves these. It looks like there may be a chiastic type structure in the section, chapters 2 to 7. Not sure if this is intended, but it is interesting to note that Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2 is mirrored in chapter 7, with the 4 kingdoms being mentioned, and then God's kingdom being the one that would overcome and crush them. Chapter 3 is the statue of Nebuchadnezzar that's mentioned there, but you remember the statue that he made, where God preserves the three friends, Daniel's 3 friends, and then chapter 6, God preserves Daniel, when both of them defy the order of the king. And then chapters 4 and 5 both have to do with the humbling of Babylonian rulers. But, again, something possible, something to think about, but it's kind of interesting how there does seem to be something there potentially. It also mentions as well the dates which the book covers. Again, 605, the first exile from Babylon, and then 536, the 3rd year of King Cyrus. That covers the time period of events that are described, or when the events are described in the book. All right, any questions on that? And then you can see again the major sections here chapter 1, chapters 2 to 7, and then chapters 8 to 12. Thoughts, comments? Okay, I can tell that we're getting full here, so we'll try to wrap it up in the next 5 minutes. Themes and purpose of the book's already been mentioned. Vincent mentioned it, but as we think about this, now we have to ask, okay, what are the connection between the events and the messages that Daniel gives us in the book and the order that he gives us in the book? Why did he structure the book in the way he did? How do chapters 1 to 6, which are narrative in form, how do they connect to chapters 7 to 12? Again, we always want to be thinking, author's flow of thought. What's the message here in the book? Every biblical book has a purpose. Every biblical book has an intent by the author, a message by the author that he wants us to understand, or his initial audience to understand. So we have to think in those terms. Okay, Daniel wrote this book. What was his message? So as we think about each of the chapters in the book, I think we see the overwhelming theme is the sovereignty of God, without question. It's mentioned explicitly in almost every chapter, and it's shown explicitly in almost every chapter. If you look at chapter 1, just look at the language Daniel uses. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Verse 9, God granted Daniel loving kindness and compassion. Verse 17 of chapter 1, God gave these 4 youths knowledge and insight. Go to chapter 2. The mystery was revealed, passive, to Daniel. Daniel didn't come up with this on his own. God gave him that vision. And then what Daniel said to Nebuchadnezzar about God, in his prayer first. He says it to Nebuchadnezzar later, but he describes the sovereignty of God, that he changes the times and the seasons, removes kings, establishes kings, and that's exactly what we're going to see throughout the rest of the book. How God is sovereign over the kingdoms of this earth. He shows it in the individual lives of the kings, and he shows it on a national level by what he predicts, what God shows of the future. That's the dominant theme here that we're meant to see. This is what he says to Nebuchadnezzar after he interprets his dream. You, O king, are the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom. Power, strength, and glory. The end of chapter 2. This is the summary of the vision. In those days of those kings, the God of heaven will cause a kingdom to rise up, which will never be destroyed. And then he says at the end, the great God has made known to the king what will happen. Again, his sovereign control. Chapter 3. This is the response of the 3 young men to Nebuchadnezzar when he said, okay, if you don't worship this statue, I'm throwing you in. And they said, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to save us. He will save us out of your hand. Then they said, if he doesn't, we're still not going to do what you said. But they said, God's able, he's capable, and that's exactly what ends up happening. The end of chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and saved his servants. Chapter 4. Steve, you want to read this? Verses 34 and 35. The same Nebuchadnezzar who earlier had risen a statue up and said to worship him, worship this statue, said these words after God humbled him by eating grass for 7 periods of time. Quite an amazing statement. Even more amazing who said it. Here clearly, The emphasis is on, this is the message Nebuchadnezzar got at the end of that experience. Okay. God is the one whose kingdom lasts forever, not mine. And he does whatever he wants, wherever he wants, whenever he wants. You know, it's similar to what Belshazzar said. Next chapter, at the very end. After Daniel gives the interpretation, your kingdom has been divided, then Darius, Darius. This is the next chapter, chapter 6. Chapter 5, God just describes what he's going to do, and it happened. Chapter 6 is, of course, the events regarding Darius, Daniel in the lion's den. And notice what Darius says. Pat, can you read this? Yeah. Again, same theme. Again, a pagan king makes this statement. Quite amazing. By the way, I don't know if I mentioned this to you guys before. One of the apocryphal books, that was inserted in the Septuagint, the Bell and the Dragon. Have I talked about Bell and the Dragon before? I think, Vincent, you were going to do a Bible survey of that, right? That story. Where it's just this bizarre story. In Habakkuk's life, the claim is that, Habakkuk was eating some beef stew. He's sitting there eating. All of a sudden, the angel of the Lord shows up, grabs him by the hair, and drags him from Israel, 600 miles into Babylon, into the lion's den to give Daniel the stew. And then when Daniel's finished, he grabs him and takes Habakkuk back to the... So apparently Daniel had some stew while he was in here in the lion's den, and Habakkuk delivered it. Obviously fanciful, but I always thought that was funny. Anyway, nothing to do with Daniel as far as the theme of Daniel, the sovereignty of God. And then, of course, in chapters 7 to 12, there's specific prophecies given regarding the rise of the kingdom of God, and the additional theme of the Messiah is introduced in chapter 7. Again, one like a son of man. It says, and I don't know if I put that in here. Yes, I did. Someone read that for me? Hasn't read yet? Thanks, Tina. Boy, that statement's sounding pretty familiar by now, isn't it? It's mentioned multiple times by multiple people throughout the book. Maybe that's because this is what Daniel wants us to remind us of. He wants his original audience and those later like us who would read this to understand that God is the one in control. And even these vast, powerful empires, where we had Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, a greater empire followed in Persia, an even greater one, Greece. Greece had the largest area on the earth up to that point in human history. And yet, they're finished. Rome comes up. They're done. Over and over, it is God's kingdom and his authority, his reign, which is emphasized here. And it will be through, we learn in chapter 7, this one like a son of man. Who's that? Jesus Christ, the Messiah, right? In fact, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, which is not just a term, it is a Hebrew term for human, but I think Jesus is particularly using that in regards to himself. Hundreds of times in the Gospels, we see this because he's saying, I'm this guy. He's referring specifically to this prophecy. So, as we step back, and he's mentioned in other places, I wanted to go to the 70 weeks, but we won't have time to do that. It's 10:04, so I'm going to get in trouble. But I like this summary. So the Messiah is also mentioned in Daniel 9. He's mentioned in Daniel 10, most likely, the vision that he's given. But I like this summary. It is long, a little long-winded as far as the purpose. You have a shorter, succinct one in your notes there. But I think Dr. Breed, when he said to demonstrate, the purpose of Daniel is to demonstrate God is sovereignly in control of the nations under whom Israel is being disciplined until the time comes when he will bring in Messiah's kingdom. Israel will be ultimately restored and blessed in that kingdom after she has first undergone tribulation and sufferings imposed by... Now, Antichrist is an anachronism because the Antichrist isn't mentioned in that way in Daniel, but we do see him there in the visions. So he just uses that term. But I think this is a good... It's basically, God is sovereign, and his kingdom is the kingdom which will reign forever through his coming one, his Messiah. So, in thinking of that as our conclusion, how then could this book apply to us today? Do you see any connections? Is God still sovereign? Yes. No matter what government authorities are in place, no matter what nations are dominant in the world, doesn't matter, right? In fact, God laid out clearly the progression of events here. From this empire to this empire to this empire to, boom, God's kingdom, and that's it. But even in the midst of being under those empires or under whatever human authority you are under, God still, he raises kings, he removes kings. He raises kingdoms, he removes kingdoms. And of any book in the Bible, this one shows us that in spades. Yes, there is a future for God's people. In fact, in Daniel 9, when that vision of, or that description of Daniel's 77s, it's in response to, and he's telling Daniel, this is what's going to happen to your people and your city. So he's giving them that future hope. Yeah, Vincent. Yeah, great point. He mentions that in verse 2. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to an everlasting life, but others to reproach and everlasting contempt. Sounds a lot like what Jesus said in Matthew 24. Sheep and the goats. So yeah, we do see evidence here in the Old Testament of bodily resurrection. And then Daniel describes the end events. So he jumps from just before the coming of Christ, about 150 years before, in chapter 11, he jumps from there all the way to the end of human history. Just to kind of give, okay, here's the final, here's the end of the story. And it reflects exactly what was given in several visions and prophecies earlier. Okay, a lot to absorb here. Any final questions? Yeah. Good question. I have not thought about that. He's also at the end, I think, told to bind these up, the writings, and not reveal them. Yet we have them here. So I don't know, maybe if that was just at the present day. Don't tell the folks at that very time he was given that. But then, of course, when he wrote the book, it was revealed at a later time. Good question. That was a good stump the chump question right there. Okay, well, we have people eager. The pastor's shown up, so I have to stop. So I stole your time next week, Vincent. 10 minutes you have to give back. All right, well, let's close in prayer. God, you are the sovereign ruler. Lord, you've allowed a pocket of rebellion at this time on earth, but yet you have made clear your plan and how you will have overcome our sin and Satan and the world. You've sent your Son, who's defeated death and sin and Satan at the cross, who was raised again to show he is the one, the Son of Man, to whom is given a kingdom and authority and dominion. We look forward to that day when he returns to set up that kingdom, to defeat all of your enemies, to save his friends, and then that you would be glorified as you rightly deserve, that all creation would know that you are sovereign King of the universe. Thank you for this book of Daniel. Thank you for the message that it has for us. Thank you for Daniel's example to us of a godly servant. Pray, Lord, that you, by your grace, would help us to follow his example, and we pray in Christ's name. Amen. Thank you.